The year was 1977. Paul Welch, a young sound engineer, lands a job with one of America's hottest bands, Lynyrd Skynyrd. Paul didn't know it, but within 8 shows of landing the job, he would be in a swamp in Mississippi on one of the most famous rock and roll plane crashes of all time. Paul was lucky to survive. His doctors told him he probably would never walk. They thought he would never come out of his coma, but he did, he does, and he's here in our studio to tell his amazing account of that day. Paul's story has never been told before, so we hope it brings, perhaps, a fresh new light on a tragic day in 1977. This interview is being brought to you by AceProGuitars.com, known worldwide as the leader in high-quality guitars at unbeatable prices. AceProGuitars.com. Well, thanks for coming by and giving us some of your time for the Nashville Facebook page. Very generous of you. You have a fascinating story. As I said in the intro, there are some fascinating things that have happened in the rock and roll history, and but it's not many of us that can say they were there. And you were actually there.
Yes. Fortunately and unfortunately. Unfortunately because of the injuries I received, but in a way fortunately because the Lynyrd Skynyrd band, I'm not, I don't see the new group terribly often, so and I don't mean this to disparage them, but the Lynyrd Skynyrd group that I knew in 1977, they were the salt of the earth. They were some of the best people I've ever met. And despite the plane crash, I am pleased to have been associated with them in any way. Great people.
Why don't we move forward in time? Let's go to the day of the takeoff. Let's go. You're on the tarmac.
Yes.
And there's apparently some trouble with the engine. Actually, let's back up. The fuel gauge apparently didn't work. Is that right?
As I understand it, yes, the fuel gauge in the airplane was inoperative, and the way the pilots knew how much fuel was on board the plane was they would stick a stick down the wings to see how wet it got.
I had a 74 Dart. I used to do that same thing.
Well, this was, speaking of 74, this was, I hear, a 47, if memory serves. December of 1947, Convair 240.
It was originally a passenger airliner?
Yes, it was, and had been converted kind of into a cruise.
And it was a propeller prop plane?
Yes.
Twin engine
prop plane, about the size of a DC-3 or maybe, well, not everyone knows the airplanes. Imagine a Greyhound bus with wings.
Right.
The fuselage was around the size of a bus.
So according to the wood stick in the tank, and somebody probably took a record of how much gas was being pumped into the plane.
Yes.
So according to the wood stick and that, they had some reasonable idea of how much fuel was in it, and it should have made the trip.
Yes.
So, so you show up at the airport. There's your plane.
Yes.
Anything unusual getting on the plane?
Sort of. Well, not so much getting on, but once we were on board, we were sitting there in our seats, and the airplane was sealed as must be, but the ventilation or the air conditioning system doesn't work when it's on the ground.
Right.
And October 20th in South Carolina,
getting kind of hot on the plane.
It was hot, and we were all a little uncomfortable. And of course, there was no smoking while they were getting the fuel mixture ready for takeoff and fueling the plane and the like. And all of us nicotine addicts, and those who weren't, who were just dying of the heat, we were uncomfortable. And as I understand it, I don't recall how long it was, but I have been told it took us 45 minutes to get the fuel mixture right before the planes would take off.
And where were you on the plane?
There, at the very front, was the cockpit. And,
right.
Behind that were the doors that we'd enter the plane.
And there's some bench seats there, couches.
Sort of, yeah. Well, when you first walk on the plane, there's there's a lavatory and the galley bar area, whatever. And then you walk in, kind of a living room area with, you're right, a curved
That's where
couch
you were?
along one of the fuselage. No, I was not. I was not in the front part there, but just behind that, where rows of regular airplane seats started. I was in the first row of airplane seats. Mm-hmm. Nobody was at least that I remember. No one was on the window seat. I was in the aisle seat, the front left side of the plane, and this is part of this is what I remember, and just snippets of pictures in my head, and part of it is judging by the chart that Alan Collins drew out for me in the hospital following the crash as to who was seated. And neither of us remembered anybody next to me, but there was me, and then across the aisle.
And you have a photograph of him there.
Yes, of Alan in my room, yeah, trying to help me wake up. I was in a coma for about 3 weeks and 3 or 4 days. It was almost a month. And the whole time I was in the coma, Alan was trying to help pull me out. He'd come down to my room and say things. Come on, Paul, I need more monitor. I need to hear more Leon. Whatever it was, he'd be trying to wake me up.
So let's go back to the tarmac now. Mm-hmm. They're having a little trouble. I guess with that plane adjusting the fuel mixture on one engine independently, at least.
I believe that's how they had, but I don't know enough about avionics, but I know that they were trying to get the fuel mixture right for takeoff, and we had trouble with the starboard engine on the flight from Miami to Greenville, where I guess that engine had a bad magneto, and I think a magneto is like an alternator or generator, but somehow it's involved with fuel supply or fuel control. And to make that engine run, it had to be run really rich. And when they gave that much fuel to the engine, once they heated up, sometimes the fuel that was not being, I guess fuel was being sprayed from the carburetor or whatever onto the block, and was then being, catching on fire. And so the engine had flames trailing from it intermittently, I guess, from Miami to Greenville. And
so when they saw that, why didn't they? I mean, if that happened today, they'd be landing it right away. What was?
Well, apparently the.
The engine's just on fire. We'll just keep going.
Yeah, well, I guess it kind of did.
I thought that engine would never catch on fire.
Well, the plane was the engine was still operating. It was just that some of the excess fuel was being
igniting,
was being ignited.
Well, they must have been running it really rich then.
Yes. And I guess when that happened, they would then cut back the fuel to that engine, and it would run for a while. And maybe it would feather, and they would put more back, and it would catch again. I don't really know, but
do you remember seeing it on fire, looking out the window?
Yes, I recall that.
At what point in the trip did you first notice it catching on?
Well, on the flight from Miami to Greenville, I recall it, and then I also recall that happening again on the fateful crash.
So if I remember right, they were actually at the end of this flight, this last one, they were going to vote on whether or not they were going to use that plane anymore, right?
Yes.
They knew it wasn't a good plane.
Well, they knew it wasn't in the best shape, and because Led Zeppelin had just gotten a jet.
Right, they wanted.
And I think as you mentioned, a little bit of pride. They wanted their own jet.
Right.
And they had, as I understand it, dispatched a road manager or some big hoodoo with Lynyrd Skynyrd organization, whatever, to get a jet for them, not the plane they had been using. And this is unsubstantiated. I don't know this to be a fact, but I have heard through the rumor mill that the company that owned the airplane with Lynyrd Skynyrd painted on it and the like, they needed the income from another tour that they would earn from touring with Lynyrd Skynyrd. And I've heard they went to extreme measures to make sure the airplane was chosen for one more trip, and that the Lynyrd Skynyrd
they might have retired it earlier.
Yeah.
If it wasn't for that.
And so that airplane was taken on another tour against the band's desires. And then when the engine caught on fire from Miami to Greenville, there were several in the band who just said, "That's it. We're not taking this plane ever again."
But they did.
And in fact, some of them, I hear Cassie Gaines at least, but I think there were others, bought commercial plane tickets to fly from Greenville to Baton Rouge. But and apparently the company that owned the airplane could not afford to pay what the mechanics in Greenville wanted to fix the plane, and they also could not afford to fly their own mechanic to Greenville to have him work on the plane. However, since they were based in Dallas, and we were playing in Baton Rouge the next day, they would just have their mechanic meet us in Baton Rouge. He'd fix the plane there, and I guess the pilot and co-pilot knew that the plane was operational. It's scary when there's flames coming out of the engine, but apparently it was running well enough that they didn't feel that it would be a problem. Mm-hmm. I mean, they knew that by taking off they were betting their lives, and they obviously felt it would make it.
You figure if the pilot's willing to do it,
yeah. They must have felt it would have made it, and so the band, as I understand it, at Ronnie's urging, the band decided, yeah, well, we can take it, but if they don't get it fixed there, we'll take steps and get another plane.
Mm-hmm. So finally, you get moving down the runway,
mm-hmm.
and you get airborne.
And the flight, just a normal flight.
Uh-huh. A little bit of fire from the engine, but you're used to that by now.
Well, actually, this and that started to take. I think the engine has to, the block has to heat up quite a bit before that'll happen.
Uh-huh. So, what percentage of the way through the flight were you before you realized you were in trouble?
Well, as I understand it, we got over near the Macomb, Mississippi airport, which was large enough, had a runway long enough for the size plane we had, and had the right kind of fuel. And there was discussion about setting down and refueling and making sure everything was fine. But they decided not to, because at that point we would be about 10 minutes flying time to Baton Rouge, and it had taken us 45 minutes, whatever it was, to get the fuel mixture ready for takeoff in Greenville.
Right.
Why go through that again when surely we have enough fuel to make it? We took on 5.5 hours. It's a 3.5-hour flight. Surely we'd make it.
But the rich fuel mixture meant they were consuming a lot more fuel.
Yes,
pilots failed to calculate that.
Yes, they failed to calculate how much extra we were using to make that engine run, I guess, and how much had been burned getting the fuel.
And if it's true that they weren't able to adjust the fuel mixture independently for each engine, then they would have been really sucking the fuel.
That's right. Both engines had to were being run rich. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so they decided not to land, and we'd make the last 10 minutes would be no problem.
Do you remember what you were doing when you realized something was wrong? The plane might be losing altitude.
Well, it didn't. Everything was fine. Then the engine was caught on fire, and like I said,
both or just the one?
Just the starboard.
Oh, wow.
And
it was a worse fire than you'd seen before?
No, it was pretty much the same. I mean, it was disconcerting.
Engine's on fire again. Yeah. Okay, give me another beer.
Yeah, it was disconcerting, but it was
right. You were all used to it.
We had made it from Miami to Greenville, and we only had 10 minutes flying time. Surely we'd make it. I mean, we were all optimistic, I'm sure. And I don't have any memory after when the engine caught on fire, any direct personal memory. Now, what I hear happened from other survivors, they said shortly after that, the co-pilot came back and said, "Sit down, buckle your seatbelts, put your head between your knees, and don't move till we stop. We're making an emergency crash landing on the highway or a field next to it."